The classic and iconic movie Dead Poets Society, Robin Williams plays the role of a teacher in an exclusive Eastern prep school. And the movie opens on the first day of school as he takes a class of boys out into the hallway and look at the pictures of some of the past but now dead graduates of the school. He seeks to motivate them to excel in life and in their classroom work with the following words. He says, "We are food for worms, lads. Believe it or not, each and every one of us in this room one day will stop breathing, turn cold, and die. Step forward and see these faces from the past. They were just like you are now. They believed that they were destined for great things. Their eyes are full of hope. But you see, gentlemen, these boys are now fertilizing daffodils. If you listen real close, you will hear them whisper their legacy to you. Lean in. What do you hear?" Then Williams says in a almost eerie, grave-like voice, "Carpe diem. Seize the day, boys. Make your lives extraordinary." Robin Williams speaks to issues of opportunity, of priority, and of time management, and certainly fulfillment of life. But they also speak to the importance of our legacy. And the question comes, what are we doing now to make a difference in the lives of others? What legacy are we building for future generations? Williams is right, and the Bible says so. It's appointed a man wants to die. We will die. And what lasting legacy will we leave behind for future generations? As we come to the close of this series on home improvement, I want to close with this lesson on leaving a legacy. And I want us to think about the older generations and the legacy they have left to us, to the younger generation, and what we are going to do with it. The wise man penned in Proverbs 13 and verse 22, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." But tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at more than just a physical or a financial inheritance. We are looking at something deeper. We are looking at something spiritual. So basically this evening, I want us to look at two things as we think about leaving a legacy. I want us to think about what is the basis of leaving the kind of legacy that we need to leave as Christians. And then how are we able to go about that and accomplish that? It's good to be with you again tonight, and we've enjoyed the week together. I have a number of things on my mind I'd like to share, but if you don't mind, I'll save those to the end of the lesson so that we can dive right into this study tonight and to think about the importance of the legacy. We're glad you're here, and we're glad those that may be online that are listening and watching as well. The first thing I want us to look at is the basis. And the basis of leaving a legacy, the kind of legacy that we need to be thinking about, I believe is based upon biblical values. And so let's think for a few minutes about the biblical values on which we need to be building our homes and building a legacy that we can leave to our children and our grandchildren and following generations. I would suggest we need to build on the biblical values that glorify God. And the question comes, are we really imparting values that honor God, that exalt God, and that glorify God? In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 12, Peter said to live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. And so as we think about our lives, and think about our focus in the things that we're doing in our family. Are we setting before our children those values that honor and glorify God? But secondly, I would ask, what about blessing other people? Are we building our homes on a value system that thinks about others outside the family circle? The second great commandment, Jesus said, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And the second great commandment has a tremendous value in terms of practicality in the things that we do in helping other folks. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, Paul said, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who belong to the family of believers. That ought to be lived in our homes. The place where benevolence begins and goodwill begins, and helping other people begins, and teaching the second great commandment must be in the family circle. But another biblical value is admitting personal responsibility. To teach our accountability to our children, that you are responsible for your lives, for your actions, for your attitudes, to learn to admit it when you are wrong. You know, there are some families that leave a legacy of trying to avoid personal accountability and responsibility. And it's always somebody else's fault, and it's never their fault. We know one thing is for sure, that there will come a day when each and every one of us, every mother and father and husband and wife and son and daughter, is going to give an account for their lives. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10, Paul wrote, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether it be good or bad. And then we need to build upon the value of purpose. Are we providing purpose? Values give a meaning to our existence. They provide a reason for living. They direct us. You think about, why do we get up every morning and go to work? Why go to school? Why work at developing relationships? Why work at becoming a better person? The wise man says that many are the plans of a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. God has a purpose for our lives. And the things that we do and that He's given us responsibility to do have to do with the purpose that He has set forth for us. And then biblical values provide stability in our lives. There are so many things that are fleeting and they're transitory and changing, but biblical values provide a foundation on which we can build a lasting legacy because they offer stability. In Ephesians chapter 4 and in verse 14, Paul wrote that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. A lot of people, if they're not careful, are blown this way and that way by different philosophy and different theories and different things that come along. But heaven and earth, although it will pass away, God's word will never pass away, and the values on which He has provided for us will not pass away. And so, like the wise man, are we building our house, our home, upon a rock of values, biblical values that provide stability. The second basis that I would suggest that we need to build a lasting legacy are the proper priorities. And when I thought about priorities, I tried to get inside myself a little bit and to think about some of the things that I was taught. I was very blessed to grow up in a Christian home that both my mother and father were Christians. My dad was a deacon and later became an elder in the Lord's church. And they tried to instill in my brother and I that there were some things more important than other things. And there are three priorities that come to my mind that I was taught, and I think the generation that I grew up in was taught. And so I challenge you with these. There may be other priorities in your home that you would think about. But one priority that I learned was that work comes before recreation. I can think of times that I wanted to go out and play ball, And my mom would say, have you got your chores done? Your dad left some work for you to do. Have you got that done? Or I would want to go somewhere with my friends or do something else. Well, have you done your work? And I learned that work comes before recreation. You know, there is a principle in the Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes, that teaches there the idea that while it's good to enjoy life and to enjoy the pleasures of life, that the pleasures of life come after we put in the work to be able to enjoy those pleasures. And one of such passage, he says in chapter 2 and verse 10, that whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. And I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all of my labor, and this was the reward from all of my labor. And so work comes before recreation. Another priority I learned growing up is that people are more important than things. And we've certainly, I think, in a very materialistic society, and you think of the advancements. I look at our grandkids and the things that they're growing up with. You know, it's just incredible. Even things that our kids didn't grow up with. Our little grandson Miles got a hold of our son's phone. They were out on a little trip yesterday and started texting us. And of course, he's only 6, and so he's just learning to read, but he knows how to talk text. And it's kind of funny when he says papaw, sometimes it comes across purple. He goes, purple. I know he's saying papaw, you see. But he's talk texting. He knows how to do that. And he knows how to pull up videos and all kinds of things. The other day, we were on FaceTime, and he was putting all of these little stars and arrows and stuff. I don't, you all, I see some of you down your head. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how he was doing it, but he's learning how to do that. Well, I'm just saying there's a lot of things today. There's a lot of technology, and our material prosperity has blessed us with being able to enjoy a lot of things. But that doesn't change the fact that people are more important than things, than material things. Jesus forever settled that issue in Matthew 16 when he said in verse 26, for what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? I mean, isn't that an incredible thought? Have you ever just thought of Jesus talking about gaining the whole world? I mean, all of the real estate in the world, you own it. I mean, all of the stocks and bonds, all of the mutual funds, all of the diamonds and the rubies and all of the precious metals, that you own it all? And it's just a mind-boggling notion to even think of such a thing. And yet Jesus says that if that were possible, that the accumulation, all of it lumped together, would not equal the value of one human soul. One little boy or one little girl, or one mommy or one daddy. People are important, more important than things. And another priority I learned growing up is that the spiritual is more significant than the material. The importance of spiritual priorities. There was a survey done a number of years ago of 300 families in the Midwest to discover the secret for the success of their homes. And in the course of this, one teen said, it was just understood that religion was a top priority in my parents' life, and it formed the basis of our family. And I learned that growing up too, that Bible study and prayer and worship and church attendance, these were things that were just a part of our life. I never ever got up on a Sunday morning and say, well, are we going to go to church today? That was never a question. Never a question on Sunday night or Wednesday night, because that was understood that that's what we do. For many years, my grandmother, Welliver, was not a Christian. And my uncle, my dad's brother, was not a Christian. And my Uncle Raymond was a bachelor for many, many years. He married at age 40. But he and my grandma would sometimes come to visit us on a Sunday afternoon. They lived about a 30-minute drive away from us in Crawfordsville, Indiana, and they'd drive over to Plainfield. And it's kind of interesting how they would come like in the middle or late afternoon on a Sunday. And it'd be getting pretty close for church time pretty soon after they got there. And my dad would always say to them, well, come and go to church with us tonight. Well, they'd always make an excuse. Well, we're not dressed for it or something. Dad would always say, well, just make yourself at home. We'll be back after a while. And that, I can still remember as a little kid the impression that made on me. And I've thought in the past, and I've heard people say sometimes that miss the service, well, relatives dropped in. Someone dropped in and we weren't able to go. Well, we had relatives drop in, and that happened more than one occasion. But Dad would always say, come and go with us. They would always decline, and we would always go. Sometimes they stayed, sometimes they didn't. But I was taught a very valuable lesson that the spiritual is more significant than the material. And so Jesus would say, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you. And then I want to suggest a third basis for leaving a legacy in your family is building strong relationships. And this is twofold. One, this is in terms of relationships in the physical family. It takes work to make a family strong and to grow and to improve. It takes an investment of time and effort and energy. And if we're to leave a lasting legacy, it's going to be built upon the strength of our relationships and all the things we've been talking about all week in terms of putting those into practice in our lives. But also there's the relationship of the church family, of our spiritual family. Well, the physical family is definitely important, and that's what we've been talking about all week. What a wonderful legacy that is left among God's people for those that have excelled and worked and grown and developed and matured. You look at men that have developed as elders in the Lord's church, and you think of those that are from families of preachers, and what a wonderful legacy they have left. Or brethren that have left their mark upon a local congregation. When I was growing up in Plainfield, Indiana, we had a man there, Nick Skelton, that had done very well financially. In fact, he actually, at that time, had become one of the elders in the congregation there. But when it was time for the church to build a new building, he gave a very valuable piece of property, donated it to the church to be able to build that building. When I moved to Palmetto, Florida to preach down there, a man by the name of D.B. Whittle, that lived to be 105 years old before he passed, had made such a mark on that church. The original church building was literally built by Brother Whittle's hands. He owned a furniture store in town that everybody knew Brother Whittle, and they knew that he was honest and his people were honest. And he had such a remarkable impact upon that community. When I moved to Tampa, Florida, and was preaching for the North Boulevard Church, Paul Andrews had helped establish that congregation from North Street many years earlier. And I was amazed as I moved there and I would meet people. Oh, Paul Andrews baptized me. Paul Andrews studied with me. Or Paul Andrews baptized my mother. Paul Andrews baptized my grandfather. And there was such a legacy there that this man had left that lived on, a spiritual legacy. And so we need to think about what kind of legacy are we leaving and what are we doing that is going to build that legacy. I submit to you that if it's to be built at all, it is built on biblical values and the proper priorities and on strong relationships. But let's take the rest of our time tonight and let's talk about how do we do that? How do we build that kind of legacy? How do we accomplish the kinds of things that we've been talking about all week and to leave those things as a legacy to be passed on to our family? Well, it begins, I suggest, with a good name. The wise man said in Proverbs 22 and verse 1 that a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver or gold. And you and I both know of people that have left a good name, a good reputation in their family, and there are others that have not. And sometimes children are somewhat cursed with the fact that they come from a family, from parents and from grandparents, and maybe a long legacy that have left a bad reputation. Alfred Nobel was a Swedish chemist. And you may not know this, but Nobel invented dynamite. And during his lifetime, he made millions of dollars back in the mid-1800s and late 1800s from the manufacture of explosives. In fact, his inventions were so powerful that some trace modern warfare back to Nobel. Well, one morning in 1888, Alfred Nobel opened the newspaper to find an article about his death. Well, that would be rather disconcerting, as you can imagine. But what had happened is his brother had died, but a careless editor had made a mistake and had run the more famous Alfred Nobel's obituary. Well, what a shock and revelation this proved to be to Nobel, as he was able to look at himself through the eyes of his peers. And to his chagrin, when he read his own obituary, he was portrayed as the Dynamite King. And he thought about that. And the article went on to talk about that he was the merchant of death, and he made a fortune through this destructive power. Well, Nobel decided right then that his legacy would be more than just efficient methods of killing people. And so, dismayed over the prospect of that being his legacy, he decided to do something about it. And under the conditions of his will, he left more than $9 million. Now you think about it, he died in 1896. I don't know how much $9 million that would translate in today, but it'd sure be a lot. But he left $9 million to be distributed in 5 prizes on a yearly basis in equal parts to those that have contributed the most to helping of mankind. And his name would be linked forever to the cause of peace. Thus the Nobel Peace Prize. How will people remember you? Will they remember you of someone that's brought about destruction and wreaked havoc, or someone that was a merchant of peace? A good name comes from holding godly convictions. That's how you get a good name. Psalm 112 verses 1 and 2 said, "Blessed is the man who fears the Lord, who delights greatly in his commandments. His descendants will be mighty on earth, and the generation of the upright will be blessed." You think about what you will leave your family. Will it be a good name that comes from being a person of conviction, of strong belief, of someone that stood for something? There's an old saying is, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. A good name comes from maintaining a godly character. In Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 7, the wise man said, "A righteous man walks in his integrity, and his children are blessed after him." You know, we may pretend to be one way in our homes and another way in church. We may live one way when we're private and another way when we're in public. But the question is, are we really a person of integrity and of honesty? Are we leaving our children a legacy that is worth remembering? Do they see integrity? The word integrity means wholeness. And so are we at home what we claim to be when they see us, say, in a church building? Are we maintaining godly character? A good name comes from demonstrating godly compassion. You know, we often talk about in Luke chapter 10, the Good Samaritan. Have you ever thought about why we call him the Good Samaritan? What made the Good Samaritan good? Well, I think the answer is found in Luke 10 and verse 33. Because when he saw the injured man, it said he had compassion on him. He was a man of compassion. And so we need to be people of compassion and care and concern. And when we are, then we're able to develop a good name and leave that as a legacy. I would suggest also that a good name is based upon and built upon pleasant memories. In Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 7, the wise man said, "The memory of the righteous is blessed, but the name of the wicked will rot. If you want to leave a lasting legacy, create good memories. Create the kind of memories that your loved ones can look back with fondness and appreciation and with a smile on their face. You know, there's a biblical example of this back in the Old Testament, the book of Joshua. You remember when Moses had died and Joshua was given the mantle of leadership, and he crosses over the Jordan River, much like it was when they crossed the Red Sea. The Jordan River was at a flood stage, and it was deep and he couldn't cross, but remember, the waters parted. And in Joshua chapter 4, he tells someone from each tribe to pick up a stone from the riverbank. And so thus they carried 12 stones out, and we got on the other side on the bank to build an altar to stack these stones up. And he says in Joshua 4 verses 5 and 6 that the reason you're doing this is that when your children say, "What do these stones mean? What are these stones all about?" that you can use that as a way to tell them of your ancestry and of the legacy that has been passed down, and how that you came out of the land of Egypt, and how God protected you, and how that he gave you the promised land, and how that your forefathers came across the Jordan River, and the land you dwell in now is the legacy from Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Those stones were a visual aid to do that. Now, today we use other means. We use pictures. We store video on DVDs or on our iPhones or that sort of thing. But there are other ways. You know, I have some old Bibles, and they wouldn't mean a whole lot to you, but I have a Bible that belonged to my dad. In fact, several actually. He never threw away a Bible, and you know, I can't do that either. I've got every Bible I've ever had. I just don't feel right, even though they're ragged, the pages are coming out. I just don't feel right about throwing them away. And so I got several Bibles that belong to my dad and my mom. I have a Bible that belonged to my brother. And they mean something to me. And they remind me of my spiritual legacy. Build pleasant memories and do things where your family can look back and remember the legacy you've handed to them. And then we build a legacy through financial stewardship. The Bible says in 1 Corinthians 4:2, it's required in stewards that one be found faithful. And so faithfulness involves a lot of things, and stewardship involves a lot of things. And one of the things it involves is our handling of our financial resources. In 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verses 17 and 18, Paul said, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they may be rich in good works, ready to give, and willing to share." I didn't come from a wealthy family, but my dad was a really good steward. He worked all of his life at Uniroyal in Indianapolis. You know, Uniroyal tires, and farmed on the side. But Dad never owed anything. In fact, he never had a credit card until about the time he retired. If you can believe that. He paid cash for everything. He paid cash for his cars. The only thing that I know that my dad ever bought on time was have a mortgage on a house. And he had a 15-year mortgage and paid it off in 8 years. And now I'd say he didn't make a lot of money. He worked in a factory. But he lived by a principle that it's not how much you make, it's how much you keep. And it's living below your means, and it's being frugal. And I watched my dad, even though I knew we weren't rich by any stretch of the imagination, when someone needed something, to reach in his billfold and pay out some money. Or maybe it was someone that come by the church building and they were looking for something. And maybe Dad didn't feel like he wanted to give him money, but he'd say, "Well, come home and my wife will fix you a meal." And I remember on more than one occasion of some stranger, someone passing through, because our church building is right off US 40, that runs from coast to coast, by the way. And people would come by the church asking for a handout. Dad would bring them home. And of course, back then you didn't eat out. Mom always had Sunday dinner. And the stranger would be sitting there and Mom would feed him a meal. Dad would put him in the car in the afternoon and take him back to town to catch a bus or whatever he was doing. And I just remember things like that. That we grew a big garden. And way more than we could ever eat. And I questioned my dad. He said, well, son, he said, now we've got food to be able to give to other people. And so we were constantly picking corn and tomatoes and green beans and taking it to people at church. And Dad never looked for anything. And so I'm just saying, you don't have to be wealthy to be able to give. You give out of what you've got, you see. But I remember that. And that made an impression on me as a kid growing up. And that's the kind of legacy that I was left. And so I'm reminded of 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 14, where Paul said the children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. And so what kind of legacy are you leaving? What kind of legacy are you leaving for your children? You know, I got time to give you this example. This is pretty impressive when it comes to the idea of financial stewardship. And it's a true story that comes out of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And it's about a woman. Her name was Osceola McCartney. She was an African-American woman. And at 87 years old, and this was back in, actually, the release date on this news release is 1995, June 26, 1995. That at that time, this 87-year-old black woman donated $150,000 to University of Southern Miss. Miss McCartney said, I want to help somebody's child go to college. I just want to go to someone that will appreciate it and learn. I'm old, and I'm not always going to be here. And so her gift established an endowed scholarship that would be given to deserving African-American students that came to the University of Southern Mississippi that had a financial need. At that time, the president said, this is by far the largest gift ever given to Southern Miss by an African-American. And we are humbled and overwhelmed by what she has done. Now, the backdrop to that story is that people that knew her were shocked because for 75 years she lived in a little frame house and she washed people's clothes and ironed them. She did laundry, it says, for 3 generations of families. In the beginning, she charged $1.50 to $2 a bundle. Then with inflation, she said she had to raise her price. She said, when I started making $10 a bundle, I don't remember when, but it was sometime after the war, I commenced to save money. And I put it in savings, and I would never take it out. I just put it in and just accumulated. Well, she saved so much money that one day she went into the bank, and the bank teller said, ma'am, you'd be better off putting that in a savings account. She said, well, I didn't know. So I said, okay. And so they put in a savings account. She said, I just kept saving. Well, she kept, and those savings accounts kept growing. And finally, the bank personnel realized that she was accumulating quite a bit of savings. And so they started putting her money in CDs and mutual funds and other accounts to make her money work for her. Kind of an interesting story. When she said when her aunt died, she said she didn't have anybody to leave her money to, and she didn't have any other relatives. And she got to thinking about the college in town, and she wanted to leave it to them. And so her attorney came over, and he said, let me share with you what you can do with this money. And by then she had quite a bit. He said, I got 10 dimes. And he laid the 10 dimes out. And he said, I want you to write down on pieces of paper where you want your money to go, and then put 1 dime for each one of those. So she took a dime and she put 1 down for the church. And then she had some distant relatives. She put a dime over here, dime over here, dime over there, and a dime for the college. So I don't know if you take $150,000 and that's just 1 dime and there's 9 others, as they say down in Mississippi, she had a right smart amount of money. That's called financial stewardship. And that is leaving a legacy. What are we doing to be able to leave a legacy to others? Well, another way that we leave a legacy is through godly instruction. In Psalm 78, the psalmist said, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and the wonderful works that he has done. Our values and our priorities and principles must be passed on. They must be taught. And they must be understood that this is what we believe, why we believe it, and who we are as a family. Godly instruction. Several years ago, when I was, and I don't remember what the lesson, I don't think it would have been this one, but I was talking to my mom on the phone. She's been gone 10 years now, so it has been several years. And she said, well, what are you preaching Sunday? And I told her what I was preaching. It had to do with parenting. And I asked her, because she grew up in a Christian home, and all of her brothers and sisters, except one brother, obeyed the gospel. And she had 8 brothers and sisters. And so I asked her about her childhood. I said, well, Mom, what do you remember? What stands out in your mind about growing up? Now, this goes back. She was born in 1925. I said, what stands out in your mind? You know what she told me? She said, I remember those times. Of course, they didn't have, of course, that was before television was ever invented, obviously. But I don't even think they had a radio in the beginning. And she said in the evening after supper was over and Granny had done the dishes, that Granny would get out the family Bible. And she would gather all the children around the fireplace. And she would read the Bible to the children. My grandfather had a stretch of his life where he had become an unfaithful Christian. Didn't go to church. Wasn't really the spiritual leader in the home for a period of time. And Mom said she can remember that he would sometimes be back in the hallway or in the back of the room. But the children would be all round in a circle around Granny, sitting in front of the fireplace, reading the Bible to him. And Mom said those were some of the best times. And she said she had the fondest memories of thinking about those times. You know what she said? She said it not only made us feel closer to the Lord, she said we felt closer to each other during those times that we were sitting around the fire and Granny was reading the Bible. And then she said to me, she said, when you're doing this lesson, tell the parents to read the Bible to their children. Read the Bible. Take time to read the Bible. The Hebrew writer talked about one that being dead, I think it was Abel, he being dead yet speaks. Well, those are the words my mom is sharing with you tonight. Parents, take time to read the Bible to your children if you want to leave a legacy. And then there's a legacy of sacrificial love. What legacy did our Lord leave before he went back to heaven? Well, it was sacrificial love. And so Paul would remind us to walk in love, as Christ also loved us and has given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God, and a sweet smelling aroma. A love that goes above and beyond. A love that is others focused, not self-focused. A love that never asks anything in return. A love that walked the second mile and sometimes the third and even the fourth. This is the kind of love that our Savior leaves for us. And if we are to leave a legacy to our families to pass on, it'll be the kind of love that we leave with them. Before we close, I want to share with you a story that illustrates what we're talking about tonight and through this week. And it comes out of the movie that came out in the mid-1990s, Mr. Holland's Opus. Maybe you've seen it. Mr. Holland was a frustrated composer that lived in Portland, Oregon. And he ended up taking a job as a high school band teacher in the 1960s, where the movie is set. And although he was diverted from this lifelong goal of his of writing this classical opus, he was hoping that this job in teaching band would only be temporary. At first, he maintains his determination to eventually write this opus, a concerto that he composed at his piano. But after putting in a full day with his students and the other demands of family, and he had an infant son that was born deaf, and the pressures of his job multiply, but Mr. Holland realizes that this musical legacy is merely a dream, and one that is not going to be fulfilled. At the end of the movie, we find an aging Mr. Holland, who, by the way, is played by Richard Dreyfuss, fighting in vain to keep his job. The board had decided to reduce the operating budget, cutting the music and drama program. But now Mr. Holland is no longer a reluctant music teacher, but he believes passionately in what he's doing and defends the arts and public education. And so what began as a career detour has now become a 35-year mission, pouring his heart into the lives of young people. But alas, his job is to end. And as the movie comes toward the conclusion, Mr. Holland is returning to the classroom after school is out to retrieve some of his belongings. He's taught his final class, and as he goes back to his desk to put some of his mementos and artifacts and the tool of his trade in the box, his wife and son come along to give him a hand. They're about to leave the room and to go down the hall, and they hear some noise in the auditorium. School's out, and he wonders what all the commotion is about. And so they walk down the hall and open the doors of the auditorium, and to his amazement, it is full. The auditorium is full. And there are former students and teaching colleagues, and a big banner that says, "Goodbye, Mr. Holland." And those in attendance, of course, greet him with a standing ovation. And there's a band consisting of not only present but past band members, and they play songs that they have learned at his hand. His wife, of course, was in on the surprise and approaches the podium and makes some small talk until the master of ceremonies comes to the microphone, who happens to be the governor of the state of Oregon. The governor is none other in the movie than a former student of Mr. Holland's. She addresses the room of well-wishers, and she says this: "Mr. Holland had a profound influence in my life, and on a lot of lives I know. And yet I get the feeling that he considers a great part of his life misspent. Rumor had it that he was always working on this symphony of his that was going to make him famous or rich, and probably both. That Mr. Holland isn't rich, and he isn't famous, at least not outside our little town. So it might be easy for him to think of himself as a failure, but he'd be wrong. Because I think he's achieved success far beyond riches and fame." And then looking at her former teacher, the governor then gestures and sweeping her hand around the auditorium, and she says to him, she said, "Look around. There's not a life in this room that you haven't touched. And each one of us is a better person because of you. We are your symphony, Mr. Holland. We are the melodies and the notes of your opus. And we are the music of your life." Ladies and gentlemen, I doubt very seriously that any in the room or any watching tonight are rich or will be rich in terms of the world standards. And probably none of us will be famous in terms of the world standards. But one thing that we all can do is this. We can leave a legacy to our family so that each one is better because we touched our lives. And that our sons and our daughters and our grandchildren, they can become our symphony. They can become the melodies of our opus. They can become the music of our lives because of the model of ministry and because of who we are as a disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ and that spiritual legacy that we've left them. And so tonight, as we conclude home improvement, it's not the end, but I hope it's the beginning. I hope these lessons can be the beginning for you of a better home, a stronger home, a more spiritual home, a better relationship in your marriage, a better relationship with your parents, with your sons, with your daughters. We're going to sing as we conclude our service this evening a song of invitation and encouragement. This world is not my home. And we need to be reminded of that. We have a home here. But this home, if it's lived right, in the way that we've talked about, can be just a little foretaste of our heavenly home. And so we need to ask ourselves, are we doing the things that we need to do in our homes here to get ready to be able to go to our eternal home? If tonight we can help you in that quest and serve you in some way, we encourage you to come. Well, together we stand and sing.